Welcome to my series on the war in Ukraine. Today we're going to be going over the buildup and February. So this is going to cover March 2021 through February 2022. So following Euromaidan, Russia's stranglehold over Ukraine was broken as Yanukovych was taken out of office. Yanukovych had broken a promise he made to the Ukrainian people to strengthen ties with the EU and eventually search for membership. Instead, what he did was, after a mysterious meeting with Putin, he reversed this decision, and so millions of Ukrainians came out to protest. And following this, Russia annexed Crimea and began supporting and arming separatists in the Donbass, which is a primarily Russian-speaking region of Ukraine, and sending in its own troops, known as Little Green Men, because Russia would deny ever using these Little Green Men. The Russo-Ukrainian War has gone on from 2014 to the present day. If you look at a map pre-invasion, pre-escalation, I should say, of Ukraine, you'll notice that there is Russian-occupied Crimea and the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, which are breakaway separatist regions, heavily supported by Russia. Recently, they got annexed, so they don't really exist anymore, but they existed for about 8 years as Russian puppets. That's about all you need to know about for the context. If you want to look more into that, the Wikipedia article is actually pretty useful. Moving on. So, in March and April 2021, U.S. intelligence noted a pretty large buildup around the Russo-Ukrainian border. Russia was pulling in large amounts of artillery. It was pulling in mobile ambulances. It was pulling in lots of things. Its air bases in Crimea, I believe, were getting more aircraft deployed to them. You can see here that you have BTGs being deployed. Most of the buildup occurred later in 2021 and early 2022. March and April was kind of just a strange, that's interesting. But in December 2021, the U.S. revealed that it had intelligence saying that Russia planned to invade Ukraine. Russia, of course, denied this. But open-source satellite imagery backed most of the claims that the U.S. was making about a large Russian buildup around the Russo-Ukrainian border, which sparked a 4-month-long crisis in which Russia would deny it was planning to invade. The U.S. would provide more evidence planning it was going to invade. This evidence would be backed up by open-source information, and so it led to this spiral where you had people saying, no, that'd be stupid, they wouldn't invade, and yes, they will invade, the U.S. is saying they will, and also here's all the satellite imagery. The Russian rhetoric escalated dramatically around December, in which they falsely claimed Ukraine was committing genocide in the Donbass. This was backed up in a 2021 December speech by Putin. They had justified the war later on. They justified the war as protection of Russian speakers in Donbass. So this was the buildup of the rhetoric, so to speak, around it. The U.S. and EU warned of massive sanctions should Russia invade Ukraine, and promised to send and provide other forms of aid, such as intelligence. They promised to provide for them militarily. Of course, nobody expected the level of military and technological and intelligence assistance that would be provided to Ukraine. But that leads us into the next slide, which is, it hits the fan. The Ukrainians and Russian separatists begin accusing each other of shelling in February. The DPR and LPR order evacuations from capital cities as Russian disinformation goes on overdrive. There are multiple faked videos of supposed Ukrainian attacks. There was this one video, I remember, of a guy holding up this man. He looks like an egg. Sort of like I don't know, he looks just like this grizzled man. Anyway, he's holding up this sign that says the date on it, supposedly to prove it wasn't faked. And you can hear shelling in the background, and you see like a burning building. But the fact that they had to prove it wasn't fake by holding up a piece of paper is kind of funny. Anyway, you see a lot of these videos, and Russian disinformation, as the U.S. had predicted, went into overdrive in order to build up justifications for what was clearly an unjust war. On the 21st of February, Russia recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as being independent from Ukraine. They officially did it, and most concerningly, ordered Russian troops into the Donbass for peacekeeping. Now, that's a very funny term, considering what happened next, but we'll get there. The 22nd of February, the Russian Federation Council unanimously approved Putin to use military force outside of Russia. And at this point, people know they're going to invade. So Zelensky gives an address to the Russian citizens to prevent war, in which he emphasizes the ties that Ukrainians and Russians have had and says that no side wants a conflict, and that would be mutually damaging. Ukraine also declared a month-long state of emergency, which I think was somewhat delayed, considering that literally the next day this happened. Putin announced the beginning of a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. One of their big justifications for the war was the Azov battalion, their neo-Nazi sort of ties, and they sort of equated the entire Ukrainian military to this one sort of extremist faction of Ukrainian troops. Nonetheless, they decided to go with this rhetoric, and the denazification of Ukraine also came with the goal of regime change. Now, some people debate this. I will say that they were accusing Zelensky of being a Nazi, and their war goal was denazification and demilitarization. So, regime change and the complete occupation of Ukraine, if not, at very least, the destruction of the Ukrainian military now and forever, would be the ultimate Russian goal. They seized Hostomel Airport and the Chernobyl exclusion zone in an attempted blitz toward Kyiv on the 24th of February. And it's here where you can start to see things are a bit strange. When they seized the Chernobyl exclusion zone, it was part of their attempted advance toward Kyiv. And I would like to note, that's the Chernobyl exclusion zone. After the Kyiv counteroffensive kicked the Russians out of all of northern Ukraine, it was found that the Russians had actually dug in to the exclusion zone around Chernobyl. But I digress. Just keep that in mind. So the Russians advanced toward Kyiv and Kharkiv, attempting to seize critical points across the Donbass region and advance from Crimea toward Kherson. This is where the southern Russian forces do significantly better in the opening stages than the northern Russian forces. The terrain's easier. They have a better. I'm going to say the Ukrainian forces are less competent down there, and less numerous. That's what I'll say. This is the point in the war where the Ukrainians are literally handing out guns to everybody willing to fight. They're expecting a last stand around Kyiv, and that is not what happens. So Russia enters the outskirts of Kyiv and Kharkiv, but the overall offensive slows after an initial surprise, especially in Donbass, and they capture Kherson. Now, the Ukrainians were not surprised, but the suddenness and the scale of the operation was not, or I should say war, was not anticipated necessarily. The Ukrainians, up until late February, were still claiming that it was just a large Russian bluff. They said that the CIA and other Western intelligence agencies, they misread the situation. That was the Ukrainian claim. They didn't believe that Russia would attack. And then they did. And it sort of took them off guard. Missiles hit Kyiv and other major cities. However, their effectiveness is called into question. I remember seeing images of airfields where the missiles would hit everywhere but the actual runway, essentially leaving the airfield completely operational. The Ukrainian air defenses and the Ukrainian Air Force also remain active, which is indicative of things to come, I think. Because if they couldn't take them out with all their missiles, all their precision equipment, literally right there next to Kyiv, do you think they could take it out later in the war? And it's indicative of things to come. Anyway, Russian saboteurs were one of the main aspects of the initial assault on Kyiv. They attempted to get there to wreak havoc on Ukraine, to assassinate political and military leadership. Luckily, they did fail. Many of them were caught. So on February 26th, the Russians failed to capture or even surround Kyiv, much surprising quite a few people who expected Kyiv to fall relatively quickly. Most importantly, the Russians were surprised. They remained in the outskirts due to fierce Ukrainian resistance. Kharkiv's resistance was also comparable, halting quick Russian advances, and that is, once again, a sign of things to come. The Russians begin to face serious supply issues, and especially morale issues. You saw tanks breaking down on the side of the road. You saw tanks having to stop because they ran out of fuel, because the Russians were not told they were going to invade. So while they were waiting in Belarus, just sort of sitting there, they sold off the fuel, they cut copper out of their tanks, rendering them useless, and they sold it. It's a sorry state of affairs, and it really indicates just how corrupt the Russian military is. Anyway, Russian saboteurs continue to operate, but they fail to take out political and military leadership, as I discussed last slide. The Russian troops deployed to Crimea begin their advance towards Zaporizhia, and this is the peak of Russian advance. This is where they're advancing the fastest. They still threaten Kyiv the most. The 24th was sort of a surprise. Now is where you see them actually grinding away Ukrainian defenses, moving toward key areas. Things are not looking good for Ukraine. They're looking better than they would have been should the Russian estimates of 3-day special military operation be proven correct. But obviously, if you were here, or here, or here, you would not be having a fun day. Notably, if you were here, you actually would be doing fine, because this whole area was reinforced for 8 years of sort of a stalemate between the DPR, LPR, and the Ukrainian armed forces. Also, notably today, the Russians enter the outskirts of Mykolaiv. Mykolaiv is where the Russian advance was halted, but, no spoilers. The Ukrainians also retake Kherson in a small counterattack, and it remains this way for a little bit. The Russians begin to realize their plans may not work out as expected, and they conduct an operational pause. The Ukrainian resistance continues to slow and in some cases halt Russian advances. You see videos of people with, obviously, Ukrainian TDF forces shooting at Russian tanks. They'd hit the front of a column and they'd hit the back of a column, and then they would proceed to wreak havoc on the middle of the column, which now cannot retreat or advance and cannot get off the road because there's mud on both sides, because they waited not long enough for the Ukrainian mud to disappear, and they didn't do it early enough for the winter to allow tanks to move across frozen ground. Now, the Russians encircle Mariupol. They don't know how long they're going to be there for, but their advances in the Donbass have relatively been negligible. All of this here, this whole front line, was controlled by them before this. This is the only place where they're advancing, as well as this. The Russians failed to recapture Kherson after a Ukrainian counterattack kicked them out on February 26th. And Russian missile strikes continue to occur, but they are still largely ineffective. You don't see You don't see Zaluzhny getting killed. You don't see high Ukrainian political leadership or military leadership getting taken out in these strikes. You do see some key Ukrainian infrastructure, government buildings, everything that was announced by the Ukrainians. Hey, we have this here. It's on Google Maps. That gets hit in the next week or so. But the more secretive stuff is a lot less vulnerable, because Russian intelligence, as we will see later on in the war, is somewhat incompetent. Now, the Ukrainian resistance continues to thwart the Russian Kiev offensive, which was based on faulty assumptions and planning. We'll take it in 3 days. They will greet us as liberators. Zelensky will flee, these things. Russian advances in southern Ukraine remain slow, or at least slower than they were. Once again, Mykolaiv not being captured. Zaporizhia holds out. Mariupol, despite being surrounded on both sides, continues to fight. I wouldn't say surrounded, but it's not looking good. Russian airstrikes intensify across Ukraine, but the results continue to be underwhelming. The Ukrainian Air Force, once again, still exists. The Ukrainian air defenses still exist, which limits the effects of the Russian Air Force and of Russian missile strikes. As well as this, on February 28th, the Russians begin to relentlessly shell Kharkiv. Now, this, as with many things in the opening stages of the invasion, is indicative of things to come, in which the Russians, if they are unable to take a city, begin to indiscriminately fire into the city in order to try to smoke out the defenders. And this leads to situations like Mariupol. Kharkiv was also very damaged, but comparing it to Mariupol, of course, is not accurate. Now, of course, since this was February and the invasion began on February 24th, this was a far shorter video than normal. I'm going to be covering all of March after this. I'll try to cut down on the ums and ahs. I will begin broadening the events covered each day. As the military things sort of slow down, I'll begin covering the political, the diplomatic, what's going on at the UN, what's going on at the US, supply packages, Eventually, I will switch to daily updates once I cover the backlog of all the war. Starting 7 months into an invasion leaves you with quite a lot of catch-up work to do. Other than that, that's about it. Thank you all for watching. I will see you probably in a couple of days. Goodbye.